Academy, they fought against United States, but Huerta, he received the arms and ammunition by the Tampico port, but United States stayed another time in Veracruz, almost 2 years.
Yeah.
They awarded several hundred of medals. I read that was one of the military events of the United States that many Navy soldiers they received medals.
Yeah.
In United States, left Veracruz, Mexico don't pay a dime, and Mexico don't lose a territory.
Well, I think that story, so that's just, the story is basically very simple. In April 1914, the German ship Ipiranga, by the way, it's the same ship that Porfirio Diaz left Mexico with, right? The Ipiranga was scheduled to dock in Veracruz and deliver weapons. The entire ship was loaded with weapons. It was a ship that went back and forth between Germany, between Hamburg and Veracruz. It belonged to the Hapag shipping line. And the Secretary of State awoke President Wilson at 2 o'clock in the morning with a telegram from Consul Canada from Veracruz that says these weapons are arriving. And so Wilson ordered the Marines to land in Veracruz and occupy the city and prevent these arms from landing. That's the story. And let me give you just a few hints about how this story is completely misconstrued in history. Number one, the weapons and the munitions on the Ipiranga belonged to American buyers. These were American weapons. And in my book, you can read where they came from in the Maestro de Espias. These weapons were bought in the United States. They were shipped to Odessa, Russia. Because there was a weapons embargo, you couldn't ship weapons from the United States directly to Mexico. So the Russian consul, Leon Rast, was actually in charge of this. He shipped these weapons to Odessa. From Odessa, they went to Hamburg. And then they were put on a regular freighter. Right? The Ipiranga went back and forth between Germany and Veracruz. Had nothing to do with the German government whatsoever. These weapons had nothing to do with the German government. It was loaded on the Ipiranga, and by the way, there were 2 more ships, the Bavaria, and I forgot the other one, Kronprinzessin and Cecilia. So there were 3 ships that had these weapons. And they came over to Veracruz. So why did the Americans land in Veracruz? It was a very botched attempt to help defeat Huerta, because they occupied Veracruz 2 hours before the Ipiranga arrived. They also did not notify the German government. Nobody in Germany knew anything about this. So the Ipiranga came to Veracruz, and the captain is told, anchor, that you cannot come into the harbor. The US Marines are in the harbor. You have to anchor in front of the harbor. So this guy, and I have the letters, he writes a telegram to the German naval commander in the area and said, what's going on here? And the commander says, I don't know. Well, what should I do? He says, well, go to Puerto Mexico and unload the weapons there. So the Ipiranga weighed anchor and went to Puerto Mexico. It was a stupid attempt to prevent these weapons from landing. They should have actually occupied Veracruz after the Ipiranga was docked, because then they could have had the weapons. So why did they do that? I'm not sure. The German government suspected that the Americans really wanted to have the money that was coming into the customs house of Veracruz, because Mexico was behind on debt payments. Right? So the real reason might have been something completely different. But it's very important to note, these weapons did not belong to the German government. They were American weapons, paid for by Americans. And here's one other thing. I read Pancho Villa's plan on how to move south. And Pancho Villa was late in his campaign. He wanted to have Veracruz occupied by the time the Ipiranga landed. So it's very well possible that people like Sommerfeld and others had timed the arrival of the weapons to be there when Pancho Villa actually controls Veracruz, and that timing was off. So it's a very complicated story. It's been simplified very much. It has always been said that the German government supported Huerta. The German government never supported Huerta. They never gave him any money. They never gave him any weapons. Admiral Hinze, who was the German ambassador, couldn't stand him. And I have tons of letters where he says the guy is horrible for Mexico and he's a drunk and he shouldn't be trusted. So this story persists about German support for Huerta. It persists because of the English propaganda in World War I. When you read Barbara Tuchman, you read historians that have used sources from this time period, they're quoting, for example, the Providence Journal, which was an English-owned newspaper in Providence, Rhode Island. The New York Times often copied stories from the Providence Journal. It was a misinformation campaign by the British, and it entered into history books. And I'll give you a good example. There's a German agent, Franz Rintelen, who was in New York, who actually met with Huerta in 1915 to talk with him. And so the Barbara Tuchman, or the guy I studied under, Michael Meyer, in his article about the Ipiranga wrote that Rintelen received $30 million from the German government to make trouble in the United States. And I got all the financial documents. I could never find the 30 million. So I looked at Meyer's footnote. The footnote says Katz. So you go to Katz's book, also same number, 30 million. And then you look at his footnote, and Katz writes Tuchman. So you go to Tuchman's book, published in 1956, and she has a footnote that says New York Times, blah, 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 1915. You go to the New York Times, and you look at the page that she's quoting, and it says, tomorrow the Providence Journal will report. And the Providence Journal was an English-owned newspaper, propaganda paper. Do you see how this misinformation is perpetrating? Yeah? It's time that we look at the real original documents. I love original documents. I go to the actual source. So this is just one example how you get all these stories about World War I that are based on misinformation. More power to the British propaganda.
Yes.
Yes.
The Ipiranga had a lot of ammunition for the Mauser, German Mauser, and then they had a lot of Remington 7mm, the copy of the German Mauser.
Yes.
And the one to receive all that shipment was Granada in December 1914, January 15th, and he used against India and the conventionalists.
It's very possible. I mean, as I said, you know, the international arms and munitions purchasing, it was a global business. And the weapons that Huerta got were from the United States. They were surplus weapons, actually. I found the sources. The German government actually observed the guy who bought them, and there's a list. Franz von Papen has a list of exactly how many guns and so forth. They knew exactly how much it was. But yes, there were weapons coming from all over the place. There were weapons coming from Japan. There were surplus weapons from the United States. There were from all over the place. So the important link is when you claim that a government supported something, then you have to really establish the link between these purchases and the government. Is there credit from the government? You know, did they really pay for it, or did the government extend some kind of credit? And every time I looked, these are private persons that either with money from Mexico or expats or, you know, some investors, the guy that financed the weapons of the Ipiranga for Huerta owned El Popo. Have you heard of El Popo? He was called the Sausage King of Mexico. And he feared that his sausage empire is going to go to hell when Huerta loses the war. And so he wanted to support Huerta for that reason. That's how it was financed. So you have to look at the links, you know, but the government, it's very easy to say the government did something. It's a German ship, so the German government did something. It's not that easy. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Vamos a tomar un receso de 5 minutos para que vayan al baño, pero 5 minutos nada más, por favor.